All right, so we should be recording. So welcome everybody. It's great to see you today. So my name is Erica Eisen, and I am the coordinator of the Writing and Academic Resource Center at AUCA. And I have also been helping out Niloufar Rafat, who is the editor of the New Star newspaper at AUCA. So it's been my pleasure working with Niloufar. She works really hard and she's a wonderful editor of this newspaper. And she asked me to give a presentation today about some issues that I see commonly with the first drafts of the articles and how we can fix them. So I've thought a little bit about the different categories of maybe mistakes or problems that I see, and I've prepared a bit of a presentation. So I'm just going to start that right now. So if there's any problem with the slides or something, please say, but otherwise I hope it's working okay. So I should say, just to introduce myself, as well as working at AUCA, I'm also a freelance writer. So I do have a lot of journalism experience myself. So if you guys do have questions about journalism, you guys are free to come to me and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so common issues and how to fix them. These are problems that I see a lot in first drafts, as I mentioned. So the first type of issue that I want to talk about today is problems with style and tone. Okay, so before we begin, let's look at an example. So I wrote this example. It's a fake example, but I think it demonstrates some of the things that I see a lot. So this is an example paragraph from a fake article. Okay, I am Munawar, a sophomore in the economics department, and today I'd like to talk about pollution in Bishkek. In the winter, the smog can be really bad, right? There's a lot of pollution and it totally sucks. Actually, some studies show that it is getting worse every year. Smith 2001, page 54. Thus, the government needs to pass new laws. Okay, so what problems do you guys see? And maybe you can press the hand raise button, because if you're typing in the chat, I won't be able to see it. But what problems do you guys see here related to style or related to tone or formality, things like that? Alexei?
Yes, hello. I believe the first part of this passage seems to be very informal, while the latter part, like kind of very official. Like this does actually the reference, like kind of reminds me about the like academic paper.
Yeah, absolutely. This citation, this reference, that's appropriate and necessary for your papers in class, but it's not appropriate for a newspaper, right? These are different styles. And you pointed to the word thus, very good. I see a lot of students use this word. I say it's not even that common in academic papers anymore. It's just a kind of an old-fashioned word, but definitely not in a newspaper setting. What else do we, and you mentioned informality, right? So what parts are informal? Can you point to some parts that are informal?
Maybe asking like right?
Yeah, this like right? Yeah, absolutely. What else?
Sucks.
Yeah, it totally sucks. That's not appropriate, right? Absolutely. What else? Oh, we have someone with their hand raised. Sorry, I can't see your name. Could you, if you have your hand raised, can you speak?
That is Sitora.
Oh, Sitora, sorry, I couldn't see the name.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I think that your question is like interesting to answer to your question. The problem here with the style is that, first of all, with punctuation, for example, when you put the question punctuation, the screaming punctuation, each of them, like how to say, it shows the tone of your writing, how you are referring your idea to another person. And I also think that about the citation that is in the middle, it's making the style, like the sentence a little bit like vague, something not in an organized way. So that's my opinion about it.
Okay, so you mentioned the punctuation. So this mark, which is called an exclamation mark or an exclamation point, again, if I'm writing an email to my friend or a text to my friend, I might use this mark to show I have a strong emotion. But in a news article, absolutely not. I wouldn't use that. Question mark. If it's a question, that's perfectly fine. But using something like this, something like right or or don't you think? These are phrases that you could use in conversation, but you wouldn't use them in a news article. Any other points that people want to make? All right, so you guys did a good job of analyzing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Is it formal enough to say instead? Don't you think so? Instead of right, or make it?
I would just not include it.
Okay.
Yeah, just cut it out. Because we're not asking the reader's opinion. We're telling them. I mean, this is supposed to be talking about facts, right? I keep using these phrases, right? Because it's okay in a conversation. But if it's a news article, right, we're telling people facts. We're not confirming whether it's true, right? Presumably, what we're saying is true. Okay, so you guys made a lot of great observations. I want to point out a couple of other things that haven't been stated. So this first sentence, I am one of our sophomore in the economics department. So there's no need to introduce yourself like this. So often I see beginnings of articles say something like, hello, I am Sazim, or, whatever. We don't need to have that because there's a line in newspapers called a byline, which says who is the article by, right? There's the title, and then it's going to be the name of the person, right? So you don't have to put this in the actual body of your article because your name is going to be there already. So we don't need to put that in the beginning of the article. Next thing I want to say, today I'd like to talk about pollution in Bishkek. So instead of just saying, I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to discuss this, just talk about it, right? This is not necessary because it's much more interesting, much more engaging to just begin by talking about it, by describing it, by giving some picture or some example, right? Rather than just abstractly saying what you're going to say. Okay, and then we talked about these phrases that are too informal, right? Really bad, right? A lot of, and totally sucks. Actually, too, I wouldn't use that. And then things that are too formal, right? In newspapers, we don't use parenthetical citations like this. This is something that is for academic articles. So Satori, I believe, said that this made it seem vague. I don't quite agree with that, but I do agree that this is not appropriate for the genre. And then someone pointed out the word thus. Thus is, again, too formal of a word for a newspaper. So as I mentioned before, a newspaper article is not an email or a conversation, right? So articles should be written in a more formal tone. And this is maybe not related to formality, but I wanted to say it at the beginning because it's a very important point. All of the content should be original and none of it should be copied. If you need to quote something, use quotes. But, if you're trying to lie and say that you wrote these sentences when actually someone else wrote them, that's very dishonest. That's wrong. And also, please rest assured that I will find out because it is very easy to tell. And I'm sure that Nilufar can tell you, we have had, unfortunately, a number of cases where students have tried to do this. And, it's disappointing because, it's dishonest. It's disappointing because then we can't publish the article. But it's also disappointing because, I think we want the newspaper to be a fun activity, something that people enjoy reading and enjoy writing for. We don't want you to feel stressed that you have to write for it. And we don't want you to feel like, oh, I'm caught. I don't have time. I just need to submit something. If that's your mindset, I don't think that's the relationship we want to have between our writers and the newspaper. So, we want it to be something fun. Okay, so how do we avoid excessive informality? So things to avoid. I'm sorry. These openings like, hello, my name is, again, it's not necessary because we have a byline that tells us what your name is. these lines I'd like to talk about. Again, instead of saying what you're going to talk about, just talk about it. It's much more interesting. Exclamation points, as I believe Satora mentioned. Generalizations, so things like most people think, or everyone agrees that, in a conversation, we might make these generalizations. Doesn't matter so much, but in a newspaper, right, we're supposed to be informing people. We're supposed to be giving facts. So, these claims like most people, unless you have some data to back that up, right? There's been a poll and it said, 70% of people think this. Please don't use the word most. You might say many instead, right? So many means, a good number, but not necessarily more than 50%, right? So please, if you're using these words, think very carefully. Is it accurate? If not, please don't use it. And then lastly, as I said before, please do not plagiarize. We will find out, and it's not permitted at the university, and it is also not permitted at the newspaper. Okay, so a newspaper article is also not an FYS essay or any other type of essay, right? So you do need to use reliable sources, right? Don't make things up. Don't just get all your information from, some Instagram post or something, but you do not need to cite using MLA, APA, etc., right? That's for your essays. Here we do it a bit differently. So things to avoid here. So phrases like in conclusion or to summarize, right? Sometimes people use these phrases in essays at the end of their essays. And I sometimes see students use these phrases at the end of their newspaper articles. These phrases are too formal, too academic, and they don't really fit the style. The word thus, as we were mentioning before, is also too formal. And then parenthetical citations. So instead of giving those citations, you can state the source of your information. So you might say, a recent poll by, such and such organization found that blah, 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 blah. Or a recent study by the UN discovered that blah, 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 blah. So you're saying where you get the information, which is important. But what you're not doing is having these citations, because that makes it feel like an essay for class. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about style and tone. Let's talk about the use of quotes. So I'm going to look at another, this is another fake example. So Dr. Nuralieva works with many COVID patients. Quote, I see many patients with COVID. They come to the hospital very sick. We have 30 new patients a day. Actually, I think it's 50. Yes, 50. And I see many patients with COVID. Sometimes we do not have enough beds for all of the patients. They have to wait a very long time before seeing a doctor. It's very sad. I feel terrible that I can't do more for these patients. Okay, so what problems do you see here, or how can we improve the way that this fake paragraph uses quotes? Satora?
I think that I'm going to eliminate those parts where it says, it's like, when you communicate with somebody, you're expressing your feelings like, it's kind of, how to say, bothering or a little bit like uncomfortable to read the statement.
Yeah, of course, when we speak, everyone uses these phrases, right? Everyone has to think sometimes. Maybe they pause and they correct themselves. That's perfectly fine, but we don't need to print it in the newspaper, right? So one thing that we can do is we can use ... this mark, to indicate that we've skipped something, right? So if you want to skip something, you can use these. The other thing is, instead of having this part where she says, we had 30, oh no, I think it was 50, you can just summarize that information, right? So you could say something like, Dr. Nuranieva says that they were receiving 50 patients a day, right? So there you can just avoid this part where she seems like she's pausing and she's correcting herself. Very good. What else do we notice? Anything else? I see it says 2 participants raised their hand, but I can't see who it is. Okay,
It's
let's go
me.
Satora and then the other person, because I can't see who it is, sorry. Satora, did you have another point? Okay, if not, then did somebody else have a point they wanted to make? And please remember, if you want to speak, please to unmute yourself.
Yes. To me, it seems like there is too much repetition, like COVID patients, patients with COVID. Like almost in every sentence there is patients, and especially with COVID. So maybe some kind of synonyms for this word might help.
Yeah, so there are synonyms. Sorry, there's repetition between our own sentence and the quote. And then there's also repetition within the quote. So let me explain what I mean. So we have this introductory sentence. Dr. Nuralieva works with many COVID patients. And then what's the first sentence of the quote? It's basically the same thing. I see many patients with COVID. Well, we've already summarized that information. So we don't need to have that in the quote as well. So I would probably just take out that part because it's not adding anything new. And then again, sorry, can I ask people to mute if they're not speaking? Thank you. Sorry, can people please mute? And then here she says, I see many people with COVID. Again, this is a place where she's repeating herself, which is totally fine. It's very natural to repeat yourself when you're speaking sometimes. So this is another place where I would probably eliminate it. So I want to note that we can't change the words that we're using just to make them prettier, right? We can't, if we're using a quote, we have to use the words that people use, but we don't have to use all of them, right? So if someone's repeating themselves, we don't have to include every time they said the same thing over and over again. We might instead just summarize that information in a short way and, save space, right? Or maybe just include it one time and then devote the rest of the space in the article to other things. All right, so very good. I think we've gotten to most of the things I wanted to say here, but so one thing I want to note. This article refers to this person as Dr. Nuralieva, and I want to mention that the first time you mention someone's name, you should use their first and last name. So you don't just use their last name or just their first name. You use both names, their full name. You can use their patronymic too, I guess. When you mention them the first time, and then after that, you only use their last name. Okay. The next thing I want to point out here is, as we mentioned, avoid repetition between your text and the quote, right? So this line that we wrote and this line in the quote are the same, so we can cut one of them. And then, as Satora was saying, we can cut out moments of hesitation or when someone is thinking or correcting themselves. If your source repeats themselves, we don't need to use that. And then the last thing I want to say is that this quote is really long. And, sometimes we can summarize the information in a more concise manner, in a shorter way. And we can also probably cut a lot of this too, right? We want to use our quotes in a smart way so that we're only using the most interesting parts, interesting examples, interesting details, that kind of thing. This is what quotes are great for, right? But we don't want the people we interview to do our work for us, right? That's not fair. We still have to do some writing, even though we're using interviews. Okay, so a newspaper article should thoughtfully use quotes, building on the point that I just made. Quotes should give vividness and concrete examples so they can allow your article to show a variety of perspectives, right? So for example, if I'm writing an article about pollution in Bishkek, I can talk to different people to include in my article many different perspectives about that topic. Maybe I'm going to talk to some scientists. Maybe I'm going to talk to some environmental activists who are protesting. Maybe I'm going to talk to some politicians who are trying to pass some new laws. Maybe I'm going to talk to people who live in Novostroyki, where the pollution is especially bad, right? I can use interviews to include all these different perspectives, and that's really wonderful. But we need to use quotes in a smart way, right? So don't just drop them into your article. Don't just use these huge multi-paragraph quotes, right? You select the best parts, you provide context, and you explain things if necessary, if there's something that's not clear, right? So sometimes you might talk to somebody for an hour, and you might only use a few sentences that they told you. Sometimes you might interview someone and decide that actually you're not going to use what they said because it wasn't useful, it wasn't that interesting, or it just doesn't fit your topic in some way, right? That's disappointing, but it does happen, right? So things to avoid here. Using huge unedited quotes, right? So I often see people using paragraphs and paragraphs of quotes that's repeating itself. It's there's no real thought given it to how to make things clear and how to take out only the most important points, right? Using quotes without providing context, right? So sometimes we need to explain a bit what somebody is talking about. And if you don't do that, it's hard to understand what the quote is talking about. Quoting people without explaining who they are. So, if there's a quote from some random person, I want to know who they are. So if you're writing that article about pollution in Bishkek, you might say, so-and-so, who has a PhD in environmental science said that blah, 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 blah. So there you're explaining a little bit about why we should care and trust what this person has to say. Okay, basing a news article entirely on one source, right? So if you're writing a news article, right, and I should say news article, I'm not talking about an interview because that's a bit different. But if you're writing a news article and you're just talking to one person, then you're not able to get those different perspectives that I was talking about earlier, right? You're not able to think, oh, maybe people disagree about this topic. Maybe there's some debate, or maybe this issue like pollution affects a lot of different people in different ways, right? If you're just talking to one person, your story is going to be really flat, right? So please try to interview multiple people and include multiple perspectives in your story, right? So that goes to this point, including only one kind of perspective, right? So, in the article about pollution, it would be great to include not just conversations with scientists, but also with regular people whose lives are affected by the pollution, right? So think about the different kinds of people who are related to this topic and try to include a diversity of perspectives. All right, so bias, right? A newspaper article is not an ad for your club, and I have to say I see this so many times. If you want an ad for your club, you have to pay for it. And I say this as a joke, right? The Newstar doesn't run paid ads, but if you're a part of a club, especially if you're in the leadership of that club, you have a personal attachment to that club, right? You're friends with the people in it. You have, invested your time and your effort into its mission. And that means that you can't write a news article about it because you can't look at what it's doing in an objective way, okay? So not to mention, my club is great is not a very interesting topic to others, right? So people in that club might be interested in learning about how great that club is. But I have to say, it's not a super interesting or unique topic, right? So I think I used this term conflict of interest in the last discussion. So I want to explain a little bit about what it is. So what is a conflict of interest? Sometimes abbreviated COI. So a conflict of interest is when there is a conflict, clash between your journalistic duty to report fairly and honestly and your personal desires. For example, your financial interests, your personal relationships, your grades, etc. Right? So sometimes these things come into conflict, right? And I'll give a couple of examples in a minute. But the point here is that in these cases, your personal interests make it difficult, if not impossible, for you to fulfill your journalistic duty, right? So therefore, it's your job to avoid these situations when you can. Okay, I want to emphasize this point too. It doesn't matter if you think you can be objective. It doesn't matter if you think you can be fair. your readers need to be able to trust you, right? You need to avoid corruption and also the appearance of corruption, right? Even if you're not actually, being unfair, even if you are actually giving fair judgments or making fair statements, the fact that you have this conflict, this, this conflict of interest makes it seem to your readers like they can't trust you. And that's a problem because it's going to impact not only their opinion of your article, but also their opinion of the newspaper as a whole, right? I see there's a statement in the chat. Does somebody have a question? If not, I'm going to move on. So I've been talking a little bit abstractly about this topic. What is a conflict of interest? What is a COI? So, for example, reviewing a play that your friend directed, right? You have the journalistic duty to fairly and objectively assess whether the play was good or not. But you have, as a conflict, your relationship to your friend who you really like and you want them to be happy, right? That's a conflict. Even if you think, oh, I'm objective, I can remove that relationship. It doesn't matter, right? This is a conflict. And in this case, you should not review the play, okay? It's just not fair. Another one, like we talked about, writing about the activities of a club that you are the president of. If you're, writing a news article about what this or that club did, and you're a member, you are going to be biased in some way. I think we've covered this one. Here's a financial one. Okay, writing about how great Sierra is after they promise you unlimited free coffee. Well, this is financial gifts. They are basically paying you in coffee to write about how wonderful they are. And that means that there is a conflict, right? Because, they're basically paying for an ad that you're not announcing, right? So this is another case where you should not write this article. I should say, I don't think Sierra Coffee is going to do this. I just put that kind of as a joke. Writing an article about a protest you participated in. So, if you participated in a protest or some political demonstration, generally speaking, it's considered unprofessional to also write about it as a news article, right? Because obviously you're on one side, right? So these are some examples, right? And if you guys have any questions about this, maybe we can talk about them in questions and answer. Salima, yes, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so I actually was writing an article about the club I'm a leader of, but it was mainly about it was an interview of the head of academic advising office, and she was like an observer of club's activities. And is it fine if the article is not about like my opinion of the club, but it's mostly about a person who was observing the club's activities, and she was sharing her thoughts about the club's activities as a person who was just watching how the club is going.
So is this like a profile of her? I mean, it still seems like it's kind of about the club.
Yes, it's mainly about the club and its activities. So it's creative writing club, and the article is about it. And she was sharing how she thinks about the club and like what are the goals of it and stuff. Is it a conflict of interest?
So I would encourage you to switch the focus a little bit. So one thing you could do is you could change it to be a profile of this person. So in that case, the focus is on that person's activities, and that might include their activities in this club, but the focus is not necessarily on the club. So in that way, I think it improves it a little bit. Another thing you could do is you could write an editorial from your own perspective. In other words, you're not trying to make this a news article, but you're saying, I was in this club, the creative writing club or whatever club, and this is how it's, improved my self-confidence or something like that. In that case, you're telling your own story, you are telling your own experiences, and the expectation is not that it's going to be objective, right? Because of course you're telling your own personal story. In that case, I think something like that is okay. But the problem arises when you're writing a news article, which is supposed to be neutral, but in fact, you're not neutral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Are there any other questions on this point? All right, if not, let's move on. Okay, a related one. A newspaper article is not an ad for AUCA. So I see this a lot. AUCA pays a whole room full of people to write about how great it is. That is the PR department, and they are on the first floor. You are not part of the PR department. They are not paying you, and you do not have to write about how great AUCA is. So I often see articles about activities at AUCA that are fine, but then they end with something like, this proves that AUCA has the best spirit or something like that. That kind of sentence, that kind of sentiment kind of takes it away from a news article and then into almost like an advertisement feeling, right? So we want to avoid those kinds of, and that's why AUCA is so great type of sentences. The other thing I want to encourage you guys about is it is perfectly okay if you guys want to write an article that is critical of AUCA in some way. No one is going to punish you. No one is going to kick you out as a student. The job of a journalist is to speak truth to power. This is a very famous phrase, even if that truth may be unpleasant. Now, AUCA does a lot of things, and no institution is perfect. There are always problems at any institution, things that they can improve. And if you see something that you want improved, if you see something that you want AUCA to do better, you can write an editorial on that topic. If you think that AUCA has made a mistake in some way, you can report on that issue. Please feel confident and comfortable to do that. And if you have any concerns, you can come to me and I can help you with that. Salima, did you have a question? I see your hand is up.
No, I didn't raise my hand.
Okay, sorry. All right. So I just want to make that clear. If you guys want to write something that is critical, the New Star is an independent newspaper. We are not controlled by what the administration wants, and it is your right. And I think it's your duty to do that. Okay. So things to avoid here, as I said, lines like, and that's why the AUCA spirit is the best. I see a lot of articles ending with this kind of thing, and I would please avoid it. Please avoid it. Things like insulting other universities. Sometimes I see students doing this too. So they'll say something like, no other university is as great as AUCA. Well, that's not really fair. Why do we need to insult other universities in our article? That's really not fair or professional. So please don't do that. And then baseless claims about how unique AUCA is. So students might write something like, AUCA is the only university that does this. Well, that might be true, but I think sometimes students just write that and they don't actually check if that's true, right? So if it is true, that's great and you can write it. But please be sure that that's true, because oftentimes I think students don't actually check whether that is the case. There are a lot of universities in the world, right? There are a lot of universities in Kyrgyzstan. All right, the last topic I want to discuss now is considering your reader, thinking about your reader. Okay, so let's look at another example here. Okay, in 2020, the COVID pandemic began and caused everything to go into lockdown. The MHQC estimates that by June, COVID cases in Kyrgyzstan were growing at a rate of 100 a day. On June 16th, there were 90 cases. On June 17th, there were 95 cases. On June 24th, there were 228 cases. On June 25th, there were 279 cases. Okay, so what do you think we can improve about these two paragraphs? Birmet?
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, the question was just, what can we improve? What are some errors here and how can we improve them?
I think there are too much numbers and stuff. Like, do you really need to know what was the number day by day?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's probably important to know general trends. Like you could say something like in June, there was a peak in cases or a spike in cases. But this, like, it's like a pile of data. It's a very uninteresting way of expressing that. So yeah, think about how to express information in an interesting way. Absolutely. Any other points here? Sorry,
Yes, I'm sorry. I couldn't be able to understand your question because I have some hearing problem. So you said that how we can improve. I think that we need to minimize the numbers because it's a little bit hard to memorize how many cases were found. Like, you know, especially when it comes to numbers, and also about the word like with a short abbreviation. Nobody has idea what does MHQC mean, so they need to like how to say write in full version, so we will have more idea what the discussion going about.
Yes, that's a very important point. I see students do this a lot. Now, I made this up. This is not a real organization. But if you, oops, sorry. If you are talking about some organization, the first time you mention a name, use the full name. And only after that, use the abbreviation. Otherwise, nobody knows what you're talking about. Similarly, if you're talking about some organization or some person, you have to explain who they are, unless they're super famous, right? Otherwise, people don't understand. So very good, thank you. Other questions? Or sorry, other observations. Salima?
Yeah, 1 minute.
By the way, thank you, Nilüfer, for this mug.
I think your hand is up from your first question. That's why you were asked.
Oh yeah, sorry. If that was just an accident, then so just to look, okay, this first sentence. In 2020, the COVID pandemic began and caused everything to go into lockdown. This is a perfectly accurate statement. However, unfortunately, everyone already knows this, right? The pandemic has been going on for more than a year. This is very familiar information to everybody. And I can tell you, and Nilüfer can tell you, probably 80% of the articles we got for the last 2 issues began with a sentence like this, very similar sentence. So, you know, if every article begins with this sentence about COVID, it's very uninteresting. So you have to try to think, how do I make an original opening? How do I give some new information that the reader doesn't already know? Because we all know this, unfortunately. The next one, as Satora was saying, what does this stand for? Again, it doesn't stand for anything. I just made it up. What does this organization do? If you're talking about organizations that are not like world famous, you have to explain what they do and you have to give the full name. Otherwise, nobody understands, right? And then, as I believe Salima mentioned, and Satora, this is just not super interesting way of giving this information, right? So just giving a pile of numbers is not going to catch your reader's attention. It's going to be, frankly, very boring. Okay, so a newspaper article should be clear. So going off of Satora's points, complex or unfamiliar topics should be explained in an easy to understand way. And you should give the reader context to know what you're talking about and why it's important, right? So things to avoid here, using unfamiliar abbreviations like we explained before, talking about people or organizations without introducing them in some way. It doesn't have to be long, it can be just a few words, but you still have to give some explanation of why we should trust what they say. And then lastly, but probably most importantly, a newspaper should be interesting and informative, right? So think, how can I capture and keep my reader's attention? How can I make a hook, write something to grab their attention from the beginning? But also think, and this is especially for news articles, these key questions: who, what, when, where, and why. So in a news article, it's very important to make sure that your readers know from the beginning what you're talking about, right? Answering these basic questions, right? So try to answer them in a paragraph at the beginning. See if you can do that. That's a good exercise for a journalist. How can you establish the key information in a short amount of space? Try to do that. That's a good exercise. So we've looked at some poor examples that I made up. I made up what I think or hope is a better example. So we looked at that fake example of Dr. Nuralieva. Let's look at another example, maybe a start to an article about her. Okay, so it looks something like this. When I met Dr. Bubusara Nuralieva, she had just finished a 12-hour shift in the COVID wing of Alato Hospital and looked completely exhausted. Sometimes we don't have enough beds for all of the patients, she told me as she drank her coffee. I feel terrible that I can't do more for these patients. Oh, sorry, I should have cut that, we'll say. So these are some of the quotes that we were looking at in that big paragraph before. And I just took the ones that I thought were the most interesting, right? So we had all that long paragraph, what she said, and I just took 2 sentences, right? I should have cut more. In November, the stress became so extreme that Nuralieva turned to the help of a psychiatrist. She is one of a growing number of doctors to seek help with their mental health due to the pressure of the pandemic. Collectively, these burned out medical professionals, some of whom can no longer work, constitute some of COVID's invisible victims. Okay, so I should say this is a made-up example. This is, I didn't actually interview this person. But what I tried to do with this paragraph, these 2 paragraphs, and what I encourage you to do is start with a scene, start with a picture, right? Here, we're talking to someone. We can see them tired after working 12 hours, drinking coffee to try to stay awake, talking about her stress and her personal feelings, right? She's not just giving random statistics. She's not just saying generic statements. She's talking about her personal experiences, right? And then in the next paragraph, we go from the personal to the general, to the larger, right? So we talk about how she sought help, psychiatric help. And this is not just her story. This is a number of people that this is happening to, right? So we go from her example to now introducing the topic of the article, which is apparently the trend that medical professionals in Kyrgyzstan are seeking psychiatric help due to the pressure of the pandemic, right? So what I hope you see from this is, number one, how you can start with a scene, start with a picture. And number 2, how you can connect that scene, that individual story, to a larger trend, right? So this will make your writing much more interesting, much more exciting, and give it that personal touch so that you don't have to start with something like, in 2020, COVID began, something like that, something that we've all read a million times. Okay, so I hope that's clear. I want to introduce you guys to some few further resources. So as I mentioned before, I work at the Writing and Academic Resource Center, and we have a YouTube page with a number of workshops just like this one, and I will post this recording on our website shortly. So if you're wondering, how do I know if a source is reliable? How do I know, how do I know if I should cite a certain source or not? You can watch this workshop. I should say that workshop is more for academic writing, but I still think that the basic principles are applicable to journalism too. If you're wondering, how can I integrate quotes in a sophisticated way, right? That example we were talking about, how to use quotes well. If you need more practice with that, we did a whole workshop on that, and you can look at it here. And if you're wondering, how do I avoid common mistakes in written English? There's a workshop that we did on editing that covers this topic, and you can look at that here. So there are a number of workshops that we did that are on our YouTube page, but these are 3 that I thought might be especially relevant. So I welcome you guys to look at those. And then some last advice. So please think, what kind of article are you writing, right? So are you writing a news article, which is supposed to be neutral? Are you writing a review, in which case you have to give your opinion, right? The whole point of a book review or a theater review or whatever is to give your opinion. Are you writing an editorial where you're trying to persuade someone? Are you writing an interview? Are you writing a personal essay, right? So Salima's example, she could write a personal essay about her experiences, what she learned in the creative writing club. These different types of articles, they're going to look very different and they're going to have different expectations. So before you begin writing, be very clear with yourself what kind of article you want to write. The Works YouTube page has workshops related to writing, so I just mentioned a couple of them, but in addition, we have a number related to creative writing. And in fact, if you guys are interested in journalism, I did a whole presentation on there about how to get published, right? So how to get published in a newspaper or a magazine or a creative writing journal of some kind, right? So if that's something that's interesting to you, if that's something that you think you want to do, I really encourage you to look at that workshop because I think it has some advice that might be useful. And then the last thing I want to say and to really emphasize is the best way to learn how to write a newspaper article is to read lots of newspaper articles, right? As we were mentioning in that first section, newspaper articles are written in kind of their own style, right? They're more formal than a conversation. They're less formal than an academic essay, right? There are all these different kinds that are a little bit different from each other. So the best way to figure out how to find your voice as a journalist is to study people who are writing right now and who have written before and to see what you can learn from them. So this is all that I have right now. I just want to thank you guys for your participation and for your attention. I hope this was helpful in some way. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to talk about them. So please, if you have a question, you can press the raise hand button and I'm happy to discuss it, or you can put it in the chat.
Thank you very much, Erica, for this kind and nice presentation. So students, you can ask your question right now. Otherwise, I would request Erica to share this presentation with us and also the recording so I can share it with the other students who couldn't participate today. So please ask your questions if you have right now.
Anything at all. Salima, is your hand raised for a new question or was that from before?
I think it was from before, but right now I'm trying to form my question. So I think in a minute I will ask my question.
Okay. I also want to say my office is room 229. So if you have a question, you can come talk to me. And my email address is this. So if you guys want to write to me, you can write to me. And I'm happy to answer your questions via email too. Anything at all or any comments?
So I think I have a question.
Okay, please.
So when we're writing the reviews or something of something, should we write like this, like in my opinion, or how do we form like the statements when we write our opinions about certain book or something like that?
So in a review, I think it's clear that it is your opinion, right? You can't say that. The expectation is that a review is your opinion. So you don't have to say in my opinion or I think. You can just say it because it's assumed, it's implied that that it is your belief. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I just make my statements and I don't need to clarify like why I'm saying so because it's a review, right?
You can make your statements, but you should clarify why, right? So if you say, if let's say you're reviewing a play and you say the acting is bad, well, that's very general. Can you give an example? Can you say, oh, in this scene, the actors didn't do a good job, and how bad in what way, right? So you should explain why you think something is good or bad. Give examples if you can, right? But you don't have to constantly say, I think, in my opinion, that kind of thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anything else? Alexei?
Yes, I would like to ask about the transition words. Like, should we use less of them? Because that's kind of stuff we learned at FYS, like the whole year. So like, that's actually how we write usually our papers. But like in our like reviewed articles, I noticed that you kind of managed to keep a good flow without these transition words. So like, should we avoid it?
I think it depends. There are some transition words that I think are just too formal. So the example that you gave earlier of less, that is a transition word, but it's not really appropriate for this kind of writing. Other words are great to use, however, because of that, despite that, whatever, these are totally fine to use. But there are other ways to build a flow, as you pointed out, right? So in the example that I gave, that article about the doctor, I didn't use a transition word between those paragraphs, but I tried to draw a connection, a clear connection between them nevertheless, right? Saying Nuradieva is one of many doctors, blah, 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 blah. So I think that there are ways that you can create connections between paragraphs and between ideas without necessarily saying, therefore, hence, etc., etc. So, again, I think this goes back to reading a lot of examples and observing how these authors do it, what words they use, what words they don't use, right? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Anything else? Satora?
Erica, thank you so much for informative presentation. I wanted to ask one more question because I couldn't be able to take notes on how to hook up the readers. So do you have any suggestion in mind how we can start a special introduction much more informative, or like how to say, as if my reader doesn't know about this, like it will be more interesting for them to read?
Mm-hmm. Let me open the presentation again. 1 minute. So here, what I tried to do was to give, paint a picture, kind of, give a scene, right? So I introduced this person, I talked a little bit about the setting, I described the context of our conversation. I think this is one way, right? So try to think of, how do I turn this interview into a little scene, right? How do I paint a picture? I should say sometimes news articles are much more straightforward and they just make a statement about what happened. And that's okay too. But I think that this is maybe the more interesting way of writing, the more artistic way of writing. So, for example, if you have an interview with someone, you can think about how would you describe that person? Where did you have the conversation? How do I make this description more lively? And also, of course, what are the best quotes that I can use that are not just some general statement, but that show that person's personality and show their unique experiences? I hope that's helpful.
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you.
Anything else? All right, well, I want to thank all of you for your attention again, and thank you very much to Nilüfer for all of your hard work and for organizing this event. I will put the recording on YouTube, and I will make it available to all of you guys. All right. So I want to wish you guys best of luck with the rest of the semester, of course. And yeah, good luck with all of your writing.
Thank you very much, Erica, for this presentation and for your time and for your effort and for supporting New Star. Yeah, like again, thank you. And I wish that it was useful for the students so they could ask their questions. So in any ways, if you have other questions, you can write to Erica or even write to me. So maybe in the future, we can have other guest speakers as well. And Erica can support us and help us as usual. Thanks again, Erica.
All right.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
Yes, take care, everybody.
Thank you.